come in the building, they know I'm here. All right, so I had an email a few weeks ago that y'all had requested a discussion on the design pilot studies, how to go about that. And so I got the email, and of course I'll be happy to do that. For those of you that don't know me, I am David Redden. I'm the chair of the Biostats Department. I'm also the BCTS unit, which is the Biostatistics, Epidemiology, and Research Design unit. And we're going to talk about a study. And for those of you that have not suffered before, this is individuals that are online. Before we go any further, pilot study, what do you think it is? Anybody? Good morning.
Some lines of figuring out if the thing you're doing is possible.
Feasible. I like the word feasible. Is it feasible to do it? Yes. And what do you think that, how would you think that they mean different things?
The feasibility studies are looking at the feasibility of the actual carrying out of the study, whereas pilot studies are actually effective, smaller.
Okay.
That's what I would think.
I would argue that within every pilot study that I've ever designed, there is a component of demonstrating feasibility, that you can get to that population, that you can get them to consent. And yes, at times you have to get consents within pilot studies, that you can actually go about and measure that which you have proposed, and that you can measure it with a certain level of precision. Okay? Other thoughts? Yes. You don't have to raise your hand. We're all family.
I think of it typically as something that's not anticipated to be the definitive study on that topic, that it's, there's going to be a next step.
Okay. I think if there are going to be, understand that I rant and I rave, but usually there are at least 3 take-home messages in every presentation. And the most important piece that you can walk away from in this one is to design a pilot study is one of the hardest things, because you are designing 2, not 1. If you end a pilot avenue, and understand, this university is great. I mean, there's going to be pilot award opportunities almost monthly on this campus that you can apply for. But I'm going to warn you, if you close that pilot application without having stated how this study itself and the data from it will be used to inform the future trial, you're dead, because it indicates you did not think of it as a 2-stage process. And it makes it much more challenging. It makes it much more challenging. Okay? So now that I've kind of gotten ahead of all my slides, which I always do, I'll give you a basic definition of pilot design. I've got some, and I'm going to swear I lost Steve. Did y'all get my slides? If not, you will be, so that you can get to these references, and I will get in there and update the references for you. But there are some really good review articles. It doesn't really matter what your background is. I'm not throwing statistical articles at you. I'm throwing basic discussions of how do you go about getting a good pilot study designed. The reasons. I think it's imperative to keep in mind the reasons for conducting a pilot study. There will be keywords that you should have in your pilot design that typically don't appear in a larger definitive trial, such as an R01 or something along those lines. I want you to always remember something. My biggest pet peeve, I want to give you a lot of anecdotal evidence, some of it that came up this week. I'm right in the middle of designing pilot designs or pilot trials for several different universities right now. What I'm wrestling with, to tell you up front. But the key thing is, just because it's a pilot trial, don't think you don't write a specific names page. You will, again, if you're going after these, if you're going after and trying to get seed money to develop a future trial or a future study, my best advice to you is you better write a specific aims page, because you win and lose everything on page 1, always. You need to make certain that you have the correct language and the correct focus. And then you got to be able to say somewhere at the end, how will you know if you were successful in your pilot? Because it's the hardest thing, because I'll tell you this, well, we'll get there. I'm racing ahead. I'll slow down. So, just borrowing from one of the references that I put in the list. It's a small study often done to assist the preparation of a larger, more comprehensive. Okay? So, what's the biggest, all right, let me ask you this. When I'm walking down the street here on the campus and people stop me, and they do not stop to have a conversation due to my charming personality, they stop me because they want a piece of information. What piece of information do you think they're asking me typically when they stop me on the street? What? Say it loud.
Where's the hospital?
Nope. Nope.
How big is it?
What's the sample size? David, I'm doing the study. What's the sample size? Like I carry it in my head. Without the idea of understanding, I have to have some idea of the hypotheses as well as something about the characteristics of your outcome before I can do any informed calculation. Okay? So one of the key things that we usually get out of a pilot study is just a small set of data by which I can look at a variance estimate, or I can look at a correlation so that it can be used to inform the power calculation that's in the next study. And you should always have those phrases in your pilot design saying, we will summarize the data and utilize it to inform a future power calculation. But that's the idea. Small-scale experiment was undertaken to decide how or whether to launch a full scale. Sometimes, you got to refine your methods. I mean, the last thing you really want to do is we've personal experience. Learn from my mistakes. Do not repeat them. Designed a study 10 years ago that we were going to look at a metabolized drug in stored freezer blood samples, and we put it in as a project in a large P mechanism where we get to put multiple projects in, and all of them got funded. We got it. Yay, we win. When we start pulling the samples, and we can't detect the drug with the methods that we proposed. Yeah, we probably should have done a pilot study before we had gone anywhere further. Okay, and it turned out that the method under which we had stored the samples had prohibited the ability to detect that specific drug. So one of the things to do is, if you're using previous specimens, a key thing, ask for a pilot study to come in and see and demonstrate, and think about it. Where would you put that? You would put that in your preliminary results section of your larger grant or your larger application. So that's one way to think about a pilot study, is what type of things would I like to include in my preliminary results that will convince or build the case for a future project. Okay? It's a small study that preceded a larger study. Like I said, I've learned certain techniques. You repeat yourself. Because you repeat yourself, then you keep remembering how important it is to me. You're designing 2 studies. In fact, what I would probably do when I say, okay, I'm going to apply for a pilot I'm going to go for a pilot grant or a pilot study and go for some of the local funding on the campus. First thing I would do is say, okay, what's the 5-year study I wish I could pull off? What are my real specific aims? Where am I trying to go? And you can say to yourself, but David, I could get scooped. Don't you understand how competitive things are? Is that going to be available in 3 to 4 years? A pilot study doesn't take 3 to 4 years. I mean, the pilot awards we give on this campus is 1 year. You got to expend the money and get it done in 1 year. That should help you understand the size and the scope of what we're asking you to do. So I would emphasize that you need to be able to say, in 18 months, when I go to apply for a larger mechanism, where do I want to be? What are my aims? Very, very important that the goals are to demonstrate the feasibility, walked into that trap, of key components, and understand. It can be, for example, for preventive medicine, I'm going to give you anecdotes, designing a pilot that's going to be put into the self-funded pilot, which is nice enough. Of course, they're not paying my salary, but self-funded, that they had some reserve funds that they want to talk about. You know, you've heard all this about muscle confusion, you know, for all the exercising, you keep switching up all the exercises to keep the process going, whatever the process may be. Well, the question has come up, what about diet? If you study diets and you let somebody stay on a diet for 6 months, even though that they have lost a significant amount of weight, they will plateau. The body just will plateau. Is it worthwhile to be able to alternate or do some level of confusion among the diets? That's the question that was posed to me. And they said, however, we think a study section is going to blow us out of the water over the fact that they're going to tell us that no one's going to be willing to do this. And furthermore, there's no preliminary evidence that there may be benefit to it. So we all agreed we're going to do a small pilot study on this before we go any further. Okay? But there's the key to be able to say. And the other thing is we are going to be randomizing. We're going to have 2 different sequences. And I'll tell you how we're going to capitalize on that information in just a minute. But can we demonstrate we have the patients here? So we've got the recruitment. We're going to have to consent them to randomization because we're going to be following them. Experimental technique, all of this, and we're going to have to lay out when are we going to collect the data, how are we going to collect the data, and can we do it? So those are key things. And notice here comes David being the statistician. Really, all I care about is standard deviation. You know, all this is actually, that's just me being bombastic. I care about all of it, but when I go to calculate or to start summarizing the data, key thing is I'm going to look at the graphs, I'm going to study the patterns longitudinally, and I'm going to walk out with a variance estimate. I need to know how much variability there is in the data, or at least an estimate. Okay, now you're going to say to me, David, you're going to trust an estimated standard deviation on 20 observations. No. I'm going to use that as a little bit of an anchor is what I'm going to do. I'll take the estimate and then I'll say, okay, suppose the variance is a little bit higher. What's going to happen to my sample sizes and my power estimates? Suppose that it's a little bit lower, and I'll be able to build out a grid that will inform study section and the investigators. But this is the key thing. Ask yourself, what do I wish I could be more confident about before I launch the trial? It's a great question. Put that in your pilot.
Jump in. This is really great. We've had some discussions about, especially in the health services and outcome space, it seems that grants really are make or break in the approach section when they're scored. I mean, typically, significance, innovation, investigators, environment, you know, you get good scores, the approach. I think your point's really about not just describing exquisitely how you're going to do this, but demonstrating that you can do it. You can identify this sample, recruit this sample. Those are the things that I think really kind of take you from a 4 or 5 or 6 to a 2 or a 3.
It's exactly, and this is the key thing. I'm going to build on that comment, and this is the way I kind of like for discussions to happen. You know, after playing this game for 21 years, you win and you lose by setting the hook with regard to the specific aims. Okay? Those are key. They have to be clear and they have to be focused. And I'm talking about the larger grant now. The larger grant. They have to be clear and completely laid out and convincing with a strong scientific premise, but that's not enough to get the job done. That's enough to get you to a 3, honestly, to get you to a 3. You want to see 7s and 8s and 9s, that means the specific aim page was really bad, okay? Then you've got to get more stuff on the pages beyond that to push you down into the lower range. Preliminary results, solid design, demonstration that you've gotten the population, statistical rigor, all of these things. Nobody's ever come back to me and said, the specific games were horrible, the preliminary results don't make sense, but we love that stats design. I've never had that funded. Don't think I will have that funded. But yet when we get and start building grants, it seems like we put the emphasis first on the design, and I'm always arguing, no, bring it back. Bring it back to the aims, bring it back to the preliminary studies. Okay? Questions at this point? Are we all kind of on the same page? All right. Okay, since we're all on the same page, why don't we do a pilot study again? It's always about getting the information to the bigger study. You're designing 2. Never forget, you're designing 2. Okay, now I'm going to tell you how you mess up your pilot study now. Okay, I'm going to tell you exactly how you get kicked out of the process almost immediately. Okay, do not come to me with a pilot study, okay, that is nothing more than a repackaged R01 that is, this is what I want to do, just please give me $20,000 to start. Don't do that. I have seen pilot studies, and I've been asked to design pilot studies that are repackaged versions of an R01 with a reduced sample size that you could possibly afford. No, that's not it, okay? That you can't do that, because what you're doing is you're overlooking the key components of being able to measure and demonstrate. You're not starting at go. You're trying to start somewhere too far down the road, and you're just dismissed, honestly. You're kind of said, whoa. They really didn't design a pilot study. What they did is they've gone into NIH or somebody else, and they didn't get this, and they just repackaged it and sent it down to the pilot. No, don't do that, please. Go get some consultation or talk to individuals and talk about what has to be measured to make it convincing. My really favorite one, because a lot of people will use the phrase pilot study or feasibility study as jargon to say, I'm going to do an underpowered study. Oh, I know my study's underpowered, therefore I'll just put the Band-Aid on it and call it a pilot. No. Pilots are not ever intended to be a justification for doing an underpowered study. In fact, I will go on a tirade in a few weeks when somebody will say, well, we really liked it, but they didn't have a power calculation in this pilot application. And I will be very loud and say, which is perfectly justified. A pilot study, you should be thinking about how the data will be used for the next study. And the key thing is to say, I am collecting the information to show that I've got the population, I can do the measurements, I can get it all, and then use this set of data to inform the future one. Through power, refinement of my procedures. Okay? So don't call it a pilot study just because you know it's underpowered, please. All right? Those 2 things get you. These are the references. The Bain 2001 is a very good one. What I'll do is I've got them on my hard drive. I didn't have time traveling all week. So I'll send these out to dated slides and let you be able to review these. But like I told you earlier, these are not statistical papers. In fact, it's one of the things, actually, statisticians struggle in a lot of ways with pilot studies because we've been hammered so long. We've got to make the p-value. We've got to make the inference. We've got to do all these things. Actually, you should really, in your mind, think about your pilot study as being descriptive. Sometimes sounds like a dirty word. It's a descriptive study. But that's really what you're doing. You're showing your ability to get to these people, to do this, to measure it, to report it, and then use that information to move to the next study. So these are very good references. Leon's also a very, very good one. And I think this is a key one, the interpretation of pilot studies and clinical research. This is something I'm going to have to really coach you about, or I have to coach a lot of other people about. Don't overinterpret your pilot, okay? Don't overinterpret it. Keep it with what you're trying to do. All right, so let me point this out. Compare and contrast. I love compare and contrast. It's my favorite way to actually do a lecture, okay? So I give you reasonable aims for a pilot study and reasonable aims for R01, larger study, whatever you may be going for. I want you to compare and contrast the specific aims, please. And then I'm going to go on another example of what a consult I did, or a collaboration I started yesterday where I'm kind of struggling, and you can give me some advice. What do you know? What's the difference between the two columns? Hmm? I cringe when someone submits a pilot study that tells me that they're going to test. If you are ready to test it, why aren't you going to test it in a larger study? To me, reasonable is to demonstrate, to estimate, to measure. Okay, those are the verbs I like to see within specific aims for a pilot study. When we go to test or to compare, am I telling you you can't have multiple groups in a pilot? No, I'm not saying that at all. In fact, if your future study is going to be a 3-arm trial, I expect to see all 3 arms represented. Okay? But I'm not prepared at the end of this to try to do inferential procedure. I'm not going to come in and try to say p-value. Point 2 that I almost make in every lecture that I ever give, regardless, because there's so much confusion over it now. Okay? If you report the p-value, then you're saying you have done a hypothesis test, which opens the door to someone saying, and what was your power to detect a clinically relevant effect? Pilot studies, that's beyond the scope of a pilot study. Okay, now get ready to advise me. Without revealing too much information, I had a collaboration yesterday that started. Someone that says, going for a pilot, and I know that, and I know that they are. I mean, they're in phase 2 of this process. But at the end of the day, I know that by the time they finish the experiment, though they only have a very small number, they have 2 conditions, 6, let's say, judges, so I don't reveal what's going on. 6 judges or 6 reviewers, and they are taking specimens and making a judgment call on them. And we're trying to show that the judges can be trained or taught to make very quick and correct judgments between this is benign or this is malignant. And it's not on tissue, though. It's on another form of a specimen. And I talked to him, and as I left, I'm nearly walking out in traffic because I'm like, holy, by the time they finish this, I know they're going to have enough data for the definitive answer. because they're going to have replicates, and it's going to be a model that is well beyond what is typically inside a pilot. So I'll be able to make the inference. And that's made me wonder, really? A pilot study? What do you think?
Do they know that method works? They know that method works?
They do not know that the methods work, but they are probably going to be able, because of it being such a cost-effective approach, to be able to do the larger study on a smaller amount of money, and therefore they can get sufficient amounts of funds to do the study through a pilot mechanism. But it's not really a pilot.
Like for pilot, you get it, you don't do a larger study, and then you got those
Repeat the question a little bit louder.
Okay, so does it look bad if you apply for a pilot study, you get it, you find out that it is feasible way to do whatever you want to do, and then you don't apply for a larger mechanism?
Yeah, that looks bad for certain reasons. Specifically, if you are getting pilot funding through a federal mechanism that is passing money into a pilot program for the sake of developing investigators and moving them through a pipeline, so it kind of looks like a dead branch. More than likely, I'm going just to share my honest opinion as we develop it with both the investigator and the panelist, and make it very clear that there is a distinct possibility that there will be strong evidence, but what we will indicate is that we have demonstrated feasibility of method. And the next study, because I will force it to be, you have to talk about the next study. It's always a two-study process. Because if you tell me it's a pilot, I have to anticipate reviewing and studying two things: what you're doing now and where you're going. Okay, to be able to say, can they, once it's demonstrated that they can go between benign and malignant, can they do between benign and different types of malignancies? Is what I'd prepared to tell them to do. Yes?
Something I often see is people testing something that's never been tested before, maybe using it, and then calling that a pilot study, powering it for the continuous measure. But then when they go to the full powered study, they're maybe powering it for a more important outcome. So is that technically then a pilot study still, or is it?
No, that's called a bait and switch. I mean, honestly, that is one thing that I would be very careful about, and that's why I said you always begin with, if you're going to say, I'm going to go after a pilot, then your first cup of coffee on the morning you're writing your specific aims is not the pilot aims. It's what am I applying for in 18 months? What am I going for? And I would see no reason to take a measure and bring it into the pilot study. Now, it can be refined, and your methods can be refined, but you should have, before you launch the pilot, said, this is the one I want to demonstrate I can utilize, I can measure and use, and if you go to the next stage and switch it, I got to ask you, what are you doing and why? Yes? Dr. Levitan. Why do we raise our hands? We're all family.
So I guess one question. So if I'm interested in cardiovascular disease, right?
You are? Yes, you are.
You're not going to get, outcomes in 18 months, right? Necessarily. So if I'm looking at
your
example, looking at, say, blood pressure and cholesterol, and lifestyle prevention, looking at blood pressure and cholesterol, things that knowledge on this pathway, is that sort of a reasonable approach? Because, if I think that the intervention would take, say, 2 years.
Okay, so that is a wonderful question. It's a very insightful question, because at the end of the day, I've been bouncing between to demonstrate and to measure, okay? And though you have now indicated that down the road, that the future trial, you're going to want a longer window to observe the outcomes. I would still say, and I would dig my heels in and say, all right, though you're going to be measuring it 3 years down the road, or you may be doing it longitudinally and observing it multiple times, I want to see preliminary proof that you can do it right at least once, even if you haven't had time to change the outcome yet. Does that make sense? I need to see that you can do it, that you can get to that population.
So, yeah, I guess the question is.
And you said, and I would avoid trying to introduce a surrogate outcome into the pilot to be able to say, well, I can get to this surrogate, and then that'll give me some stuff to talk about. And no, I would like you to use the same outcomes, even though the windows may be longer. Show me that, again, you're getting a little bit ahead of, let me ask you something. In a pilot, do you have to prove you're effective? Did I say anything yet about treatment effects? Have I asked you yet about anything about clinically relevant effect sizes like all statisticians must do in every conversation? Have I? Why? Because it's a pilot. Because it's a pilot. And there's always that temptation to rush ahead. All right, that's fine for us to say that we're going in the larger study to measure change. Change implies how many measurements? And at least 2. Don't use the word change without giving me at least 2 measurements, please. I've had grants that came in that said, we're going to measure it this time and then measure change. And I'm like, what? 2. Okay? Even if your windows are longer than what can be done in a pilot study, you've got to demonstrate you can measure it. So continue to focus there.
So if she's measuring something that's over 3 years, how is she showing it's feasible to keep those people on study for 3 years?
That's the catch, is you can get to the population and you're going to have to acknowledge that limitation. We're not going to be doing a 3-year pilot study. That's going to be one of those things that you have to address and demonstrate, look, these were what I could do in a pilot. I can show that I can measure my outcome. I can get to the population. Now, you can use, one of the things you can say, I am going to use the baseline or the data from the pilot to inform me about the variability. But the limitations of my pilot were the fact that I can't follow people for 3 years. So I have this strategy to address that. And furthermore, I needed 2 measurements. I could only get 1. Therefore, I'm going to have to assume this level of correlation between the measurements. You get what you can. But, but if you did, it's where you're going to wrestle. This is why pilot trials are the hardest things to design. Pushing so hard to get to the big study, making the scope of the pilot out of a year. And year, 18-month period. And that's the way I would think about a pilot trial. I mean, I get nervous when people start telling me they're doing a 3-year pilot. Come on. All right. So, again, estimate, because again, and that's, remember when I was very careful to emphasize to test. When you start saying you're testing, then you are looking at effects at that point. I don't think that going back to the study that I'm doing with the interchanging of the diets. I told you, I'm going to build a graph at the end of the study and be able to see, do I see continued decrease like they're predicting? I'll estimate a standard deviation from it. But the one thing I will put my heels in and fight like a dog, I will not let the investigators take any observed difference between the 2 and use it for the power calculation. Seems odd, doesn't it? Why not just use the data to inform because the bottom line, I don't use data to inform what is a clinical opinion. I need you to be able to come to me and say, this is the clinically relevant difference that matters, and that's what we target. I look at the pilot studies as to help me get the things. Here's a great phrase statisticians use: the nuisance variables. Nobody really wants to study variance. It's in the way. We need to estimate it to be able to study a difference. We don't want to care about the variability of the people. We want the difference between the groups. So we use the pilot study to estimate that nuisance variable. What are the other nuisances that the study section can give you? Well, are you certain you can get to the population? Take that out with a pilot study. Are you certain that you can measure it? Have you refined your procedures? Take all those questions out with a pilot study and put it in your preliminary results. All right? So you already figured it out. It's to demonstrate the feasibility of key components of a larger future trial. It's also to guide the design, okay? Now, think about that. Think about what I just said. I need this study to guide the final design, or the guide to guide the design. In other words, is to inform me of things as I am finalizing this, the beginning of this bigger one, which implies that you've reasoned out before you ever started your pilot where you're going. That's the key thing. You've got to have that there. All right? Please, please. I mean, I told you, it's 21 years of doing this job. And I'm still fighting. Well, we got to talk about where's the two-sample t-test? Not in a pilot. Not in a pilot. Talk about, we're going to summarize, we're going to calculate the means, we're going to build the graphs to look at, and that's the other thing, keep in mind, especially, I mean, I know I'm coaching a lot, especially with a grant application. A graph from a pilot study you did is worth gold in that application if it can support the underlying aims. So that's what you're looking at. But hold off on trying to get to your p-values or drawing inferences. Avoid that like the plague, because at that point you're drifting into doing the bigger study. You're running ahead. Yes, Muggs, I see a comment.
No, so along those lines, something that when I review pilots and research R34 that I'm often critical of is, so beyond even the primary effect side, a lot of behavioral intervention or observational studies, folks want to look at moderation and mediation and secondary analyses. So, a lot of times I see that introduced, we're going to look at moderating in the pilot. So I think building on, you can't even draw inference on your primary outcome, forget the idea. So how do you suggest folks then, if that is a longer term goal of the second phase of the trial, is it just demonstrating we think these might be important mediators or moderators and we can measure them?
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And keep in mind that in the very large study, you are required to have, by NIH standards, it's always been there, they just put a bigger flashlight on this year, is the phrase, the scientific premise. The scientific premise. And that scientific premise comes from two things, okay? It comes from your critical assessment, not your review, not listing out. I found all these studies that did this. It's your critical assessment. I'm not saying I didn't say unprofessional. I said critical, which means you're taking an eye and identifying the strengths of what's in the literature, the weaknesses of what's in the literature, as well as your own methods. When you do your scientific premise and you're talking about the strengths and the weaknesses of the literature, they're also expecting you somewhere in the grant to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of your own work with regard to pilot studies or preliminary studies. And what I would do if I was going to go to do things like mediation and moderation, I think the most appropriate strategy is to say I can measure potential mediators in the population within my pilot study, and from the literature There is some evidence that these could be mediators and moderators, and I am using this study to fill in that gap. That's what I would do. Make sense? Remember, research is not this study, then another study, then another study, unless you're a statistician. Your studies should be a path. They should be continual stepping stones. Think of the pilot study as the first step. And sometimes, and then once you get the process going, you can, and the cool thing about larger studies is as you're getting through the process, you can continue to expand the scope, look at the feasibility of other things, and just continue the process as you go. All right? Did you hear what I said? All right, here's the third final point, okay? Well, what were the first two? Help me remember. I have terrible insomnia, so I quickly forget things. What were the... Huh? You're doing two products, but you're only selling the first one to begin with. You're pointing where the second one's going to be, but you're demonstrating two products, and this one must come first, and you're limiting the scope of it. What's the second one? What? That, I heard something. The thing is you're not testing yet. Okay, two studies, and this is where you're doing the descriptive and you're demonstrating, you're measuring, you're showing you have it all, that you've worked out what is necessary to pull it off. Okay? The third point is you win and you lose with the aims. Okay? I've said it 1,000 times. When you're designing something, you got maybe 3 paragraphs to convince people why this is important. Okay? 3 paragraphs. If you haven't set the hook within those 3 paragraphs, before you get into your aims, then I know I've been on study section a lot. I get off that first page and I'm not convinced. I'm being recorded, but I'm telling the truth. Mark Twain said, always tell the truth. That way you don't have to remember what you said. I get off that page and I'm not convinced. I'm looking for reasons not to fund you. If I get off the first page and I'm convinced, now I'm looking for and asking the question, does the preliminary studies give me enough confidence to proceed? Is there statistical rigor here that gives me enough confidence to proceed? So the key here is just because it's a pilot study doesn't mean you get an excuse to be lazy on the aims. Just be careful to use the words demonstrate, estimate, to make them pilot study aims. But don't get lazy on it. Make it very clear what you're doing, how it relates to the long-term trajectory, and then, like I said, think about it this way. Where you would be tempted to put your power calculation, don't write a power calculation. Write the section that says this is how the information from this study will be used to inform the future design. That's the key piece. All right?
For the specific aims page prior to the reduction of the aims, the outcomes grant, like a larger grant, that would be more fun. The background of these health things and blah, blah, blah. For a pilot study would be more of the background of the particular way you're going to measure it or the intervention style or...
Now, this is why people love me. Yes. Think about it this way. Keep in mind about your pilot over and over. It is pointing toward the future bigger study. So you're going to need to detail the problem that's going to be addressed in the future study. So I would start my first paragraph with, this is a major problem. This is where we need to go. The first step before we can launch a definitive trial or a large, well-powered trial, a well-designed, highly powered, statistically powered trial, we need to demonstrate the following. Boom, you've set the hook and then you lay it out.
I think if you're trying to save space, you don't have to necessarily be specific about the problem. You want to just say, like, lung cancer is.
Lung cancer is bad.
Lung cancer.
No.
If you're reading through these applications, almost everyone starts with that sentence and they're just like,
No. In fact, again, I don't mean this to be bad, but that kind of is one of the things that when I look and the first paragraph is, yeah, we all know this. You need to come in with sometimes I even encourage people to state there is begin with, there is a desperate need for this. And then circle back around to say, okay, and this is why it's so desperate. And then say we need to do a trial. And then, before we can do the trial, we need to demonstrate the following. We need to measure the following. Lead from there. The question, again, you have had your first cup of coffee. Now on your second, so your first cup of coffee was to sit there and think about the big project 18 months down the road, 18 to 24 months down the road. What is it that you really want to do? Okay, you finish that cup of coffee, you finish that page, here comes the second cup of coffee, and you ask yourself, what must be demonstrated or refined to make the larger trial more likely to succeed? Because that's where you're going to anchor your pilot. Does it make sense? All right, I think you got that. It's why I lost my hair. Seriously. The lack of hypothesis testing, and the reason statisticians cringe when they say, okay, we're going to design a pilot, because then we know we're going to have this long conversation. How do you justify your sample size? Okay, tell me, how do we justify the sample size?
In a pilot study,
Yeah.
how many people you think you can get on it?
you should like figure out, if you have a battle together of, okay, this comes out this way, then this will be how many people I need to study.
Yeah, but you see, that's it. But you see, that's down the road. So after I've done my pilot, and I did it on 20 individuals, now I have my standard deviations, and I have the information I needed to estimate, so now I can build it. How did I pick 20? Out of the hat.
Well, how many people?
At least that was a nice way to say it. No, everybody, no, this is exactly what I expect. Everybody, let's go. How do we do it?
What's how many people in a small clinic, and how many people can, you have 10 people a day in clinic, so you think, okay, I'm going to have 18 weeks, 20 weeks of this project, I need 10 people in the clinic, how do we get 5, you estimate how many might be reasonable to recruit, 50 people.
All right, so that's every time you're talking about any kind of getting toward population, you got to talk about a rate at which you could see these people, and you do not ever assume that you're going to get all of them. You have it at that's the optimistic piece. You bring it down even further, and then you say, based upon that, if I'm running, and I'm going to say I'm going to be running at 6 months for 6 months, then that gives you a ballpark. Okay? Go ahead.
And the other pieces, you have to make sure.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but all you just said is, this is the quantity I can get to. Go ahead.
So I think practical, but also you want to show that you have enough people that say that you can collect this population. I mean, it has to be big enough that it's believable in your next step.
Agreed. Okay? That's a key component for the next phase. So as you're doing your pilot, you're getting the evidence that you have the access, and you're able to quantify how big that real population is. But how do I pick my sample size for my pilot?
You got to start with what you're going to measure.
Okay?
Because if you know what you're going to measure,
Or how intensive it may be.
What's that?
How intensive it may be.
Well, not even, well, that's part of it, but I was thinking more along the lines of, what do you know about the thing you're trying to measure? If you're measuring something where the value's all over the place, it's a different strategy than if you're measuring something where everyone tends to cluster one into the other. If you know what you're measuring, you can look what other people have done and whether they've failed or succeeded based on what they've got. Then I think you can start to figure out, can I answer it in my clinical practice with what I have?
Okay. So you just said that part of it depends on how variable the outcome is. If it's a noisy one, you might want to go higher. If you think it's going to be kind of consistent, there's less variability, you could probably capitalize upon that fact and do a little bit fewer.
Unless you've got like an absurd.
Because so you're talking about, you know what you're talking about right now, you're talking about precision. You're asking yourself, how many do I need to get somewhat of a precise estimate? Remember, to measure, to estimate. Go back to the idea. Your sample size is in your definitive trial. How do you pick your sample size in your definitive trial? Think about it. The effect size, and the effect size is dependent upon your specific aims, right? So what you do there is you're using your specific aims to inform the power calculation. I told you within a pilot study is to demonstrate and to measure. To test implies power. To demonstrate to measure means to estimate. Do you see the difference? To test means to infer, but to measure and to estimate, all it just means, or to describe, is just for me to come back and come up with just a preliminary estimate that I can have some confidence in. That's all. A lot of times people will use confidence intervals to justify their sample size for a pilot trial. And that's kind of a razor. Sometimes it works, sometimes it's not a good idea to do that, especially if it's noisy, because then you're going to be revealing that at the end of the day, you're going to have a very broad confidence interval.
Taking a step back, not so much asking how to measure it, but how to describe the measurement proposal in the way to appear to be thoughtful and rational. It seems like the elements are basically, you would somewhere acknowledge the fact that this is not an estimate based on any particular mathematical calculation. It's based on a combination of planning plus what's available to you, plus some reckoning of what other people have done.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's what it boils down to. And at the end of the day, so I told you, I'm designing one for preventive medicine. We decided 20. How? Because at the end of the day, that's what we can afford in a pilot study. It'll show that we can push it and we're hoping to be able to recruit at that rate. So we'll be able to demonstrate a recruitment rate, that we'd be able to demonstrate that we can randomize them, that they would be willing to hopefully alter not the diet one time, but alter the diet twice, and to adhere to it. Adherence is another thing that's always a very good thing to estimate, possibly in a pilot study if it's a short time. But it's just, at the end of the day, you're putting out a number that you believe you can get to, and that from there you'll be able to estimate something, and that's it.
So you're essentially describing your target, what you're going to hit. Then the sampling strategy, does it make more sense, or is there an advantage or disadvantage to saying, I'm going to say, if I have access to more than enough patients to pull this off, would it be better to take a random sample and say, I'm going to randomly select from people who would be eligible, do whatever, and pick them? Would it be better just to say, keep things simple, and I'm going to do the next consecutive patients that target?
Yeah, I would definitely keep it simple in the pilot. All right? So power, just remember, don't come to my office and say, hey, David, I'm doing a pilot study. Can you give me a power calculation? Don't do that. Don't do that. That's not going to end well. Come to me. If you go to talk to a statistician or methodologist about a pilot study, emphasize this is what I'm measuring, and ask them how should we summarize it, and then discuss if I can get 20, if I can get 30, what type of information would you squeeze out of that type of data to inform the power calculation, and keep it there. All right? It's my best advice to you. All right. like I said, often sample sizes are justified by using confidence intervals. Sometimes I can use that to my advantage. Sometimes I choose not to use that. I actually like the answer that went around the table. I think we begin with the question of what is feasible that can be observed in 12 to 18 months. We get it, and we use that information to the best of our ability to inform the next calculation. If you've got more than enough, then you need to sit down with the methodologist and talk about how you select from within there. Aims, again, 3 points. Aims, aims, aims. No testing, please. No testing. And this, in the third point, if you write this and that last paragraph doesn't tell me where you're going, you've just shot yourself in the foot. Okay, you gotta have it as that complete piece. So if you ask me at the end of a well-designed pilot study, you've got the very beginning aims that are talking specifically about what needs to be demonstrated, measured to inform the next one. Okay, and then what you have to end up doing is you've got to, I'm going to say it one more time, you've got to say how that's going to be used as the concluding piece to inform the next study. All right. Examples of goals, because I do think that you need to be. Sure.
I just want to sort of, can you give an example maybe of how you would word the specific aims in your pilot study? I mean, do you want to use the buzzwords like this study will show the feasibility?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm a big fan of buzzwords. Huge fan of buzzwords, especially under the new umbrella of the rigor, reproducibility, and transparency. I have over and over emphasized. Reviewers are going to look at this. I'll tell you right now, it doesn't matter if it's a pilot study. It doesn't matter if it's R01s. They're going to look at it. I try to get to them as soon as I can, but I'm reviewing things a week before study section, getting things together, knowing I've got 5 days to pull it off. And yes, I know for a fact certain people will search a grant looking for the exact phrase, scientific premise. It would be wise to put the exact phrase in there just in case they do that, so that they can get to it immediately and find it. So if you're doing the pilot study, use the words that reviewers anticipate in a pilot study. Feasibility, measurement, things along those lines. Please. Again, the things that can kill a grant. Okay, things that kill a big grant. Great specific aims, but a bait and switch on the power calculation. Seen it happen too many times. These are the aims, but we really don't, we talk about this outcome here, and the power calculation doesn't even match that outcome. Doomed, gone. Okay, or another thing that kills you, specific aims here, and the analysis plan doesn't seem to address and is too generic. Doesn't really address the outcomes listed. That's a death. A death in a pilot, you can design great, and you lose that, you don't put that paragraph in there. Everything can be there, but if you leave that one piece out of how it will go to, what is the next one, if you leave it out, I guarantee you, you're not gonna make it. Because it shows that, in fact, I would say that paragraph to me is of the highest importance, because, and I'm not saying it's higher than the aims, but those two things are really going to be where I anchor my judgment. One moment, Moggs.
The phase 2 of is a multi-site trial, and oftentimes the pilot can be done at a single site. It's not really realistic to do it. What kind of language needs to be, or thought needs to be included in the pilot relative to the fact that the second is a multi-site trial?
That is a great question. So what I would say specifically, the language I would throw in is, even though that you're developing the measure, the procedure at institution A, the pilot will inform protocol and the standard operating procedures of how to collect the measurements across the multi-site. In other words, we're using this one here to refine it, and that what we learn here informs how we train all the sites to do it through a standard operating procedure.
Yeah, just trying to think around what, beyond that language, are there other, without doing the
What time do we
math
end?
part, other data that you can capture to demonstrate their buy-in and those things? Just trying to accelerate. Sometimes you want the process to go from pilot to multi-site, intervention plus the random. You know what I mean? And just trying to think around, I don't know, any advice in terms of what additional, beyond the idea that this is here, are there certain things you would look for from the other sites to say, okay, I have confidence beyond the procedures that these sites can, deliver?
Part of me would argue that on a multi-site trial, I would say that is the evidence that has to be within the larger study, that they have access to the population. I would expect them to have been, I think it would be a stronger one to be able to say, not that they themselves everybody did pilot at each of their institutions. That's not going to be feasible. Nobody's going to buy that. But in the preparation for the larger one, if all the groups have agreed to be informed by the pilot and have had input into the pilot, and that they're going to use the information from that pilot to design the protocol and the standard operating procedures, I think that's the best you can squeeze out of it. All right, so again, the other thing is also to keep in mind, they're going to want to know, goals. How will you know that you were successful throughout at the end of the pilot study? How are you going to know that you should launch to the next? Okay. You could say, and I've used this before, pilot study, I'm worried about the standard deviation because that's important to me. But when I say the confidence interval approach, I'll say things along that I'll take the confidence interval off of the variance, be able to use that information to guide my future power calculation. One of the ones I did years ago, we did weightlifting for, I'm not saying geriatrics, folks. I'm just saying people that are older, and seeing the benefits of that with regard to bone density and things along those lines. There's a question, could we get people to do it? And just saying 27 or more of the 30% complete 85% of the weightlifting sessions, that those would be the benchmarks by which we would consider ourselves to be successful. Where do those come from? The air. They come out of what you believe to be clinically relevant. I know it's uncomfortable, but science does always depend on your clinical judgment at times and your ability to say what is meaningful. Whoa, sorry, just walked down the rabbit trail. That's my job to ask you. That's not your job to ask me. You see, I would tell you as a statistician, I would not be very comfortable if you told me that 40% of my data is going to be missing. I would be very uncomfortable with that, or that I would have a 40% dropout rate. That would make me very uncomfortable. But as a clinician, you need to be able to tell me what a reasonable expectation would be with regard, and you got to ask yourself, and this is one of the things where you're, again, wrestling between that future trial and what you're designing here. Are you and just...
I guess what I'm currently asking is, you can be optimistic in these things and try to see this sort of these perfect trial lists, but how much do you but if you can't achieve those, you should predict that.
You don't shoot yourself too much. You really don't. I'll be very blunt, because at the end of the day, the committee, the group that reviewed you to go from is not going to be the same group that reviews you when you're going for the larger one. But it's important to think about, and what I'm trying to get to here with the benchmarks is convincing the reviewers or the people who are for this pilot trial that you have thought to yourself, what must I achieve here for you yourself to be confident to move to the next stage? Does that make sense? Because it's not that, well, I just finished the pilot, I checked the box, and now let's go. It's, is this information to you? What do you need to see for you to say, as a PI, I'm confident and ready to launch to the next one? And those are the type of benchmarks I kind of want you to have in your head. And describe.
My question, please. Often in pilot studies, you're testing something, you're not testing something, you're looking at something that hasn't been looked at before, examining something that hasn't been looked at before.
I think that makes this part harder.
So if you're going to, how are you going to use, where are you going to get your estimates? If you're not going to take the estimates from your pilot study, otherwise you're just putting estimates out of the air.
All right.
You might know what a clinically significant effect size is, but ultimately you might have to pick an estimate. And would the pilot study not inform your estimate?
It will, but I do not want you to anchor it there. Does that make sense? Because again, data informs opinions. It is, to me, when we have the data, the thing that I gets frustrated, and we're going to get here in just a minute, adaptive designs in statistics, adaptive clinical trials. I'm perfectly fine with adaptive clinical trials, where you've launched, you're halfway through, you get to look at the data, and you get to say, how badly off were my assumptions? Do I need to correct the course of this ship? I have no problem with it as long as you're looking at the nuisance variables. In other words, if you're off on the variances or you are off on some correlation assumptions, that's fine. But if you choose in the middle of the course to say, ooh, that we said a clinically relevant difference is 2.5. Ooh, we're at 1.2. Okay, let's now adjust to clinically relevant 1.2. I got a problem with that as a statistician. That's what I'm trying to get you to avoid here, is you may look at the estimates and the variability, but I still want you to be able to say, if it's smaller than what you wanted or you were hoping, have confidence in the 2.5. Can you refine your methods to get there? But don't all of a sudden take the 1.2 to be, oh, now that's what I'm going to go for clinically effect. No, I do not like that. Okay? Can I randomize? Of course you can. There might be really good reasons to. You got to be able to prove that people are willing to be randomized. Now, if I randomize, or even if I don't randomize, can I use the results of my pilot trial to estimate a treatment difference and use that in my power calculation? My recommendation is no. Rely on your review of your literature. You may use this as a piece of it, but don't rely on this solely. Effect sizes come from a review of the literature and your, and yes, I'll use the phrase, expert clinical opinion. Okay? That's a key thing. And then I think this may be questions and discussions. I thought there was going to be one more. There is, oh, I took one slide out. Wait, back up. Wait, did I miss something? I took one out. Here's a great question. Back up. Here's a question for you. Can you run a trial, let's say you do 30, 35 pilots, and it's gone really exceptionally well. Your pilot, I mean, you rocked it. And you're comfortable on proceeding. Can you roll those 35 into your definitive trial?
You plan the study to be a role in the study.
All right. One answer. I have an N of 1. Let's go. I heard a maybe. I'll give you 3 options. Yes, no, maybe. Who all wants to say yes? You're tempted. Who all wants to say definitively, heck no? And who wants to say maybe? Okay. All right, then let me change the questions. I am the statistician. Under what conditions could you? Under what limited set of conditions could you? In other words, non-significant changes within your protocol. It's very unlikely. What else? Population has to be representative. You can't be switching your population. What else? You can't change your outcome. You can't modify your outcome. You can't modify the instrument by which you are measuring your outcome. You can't modify the procedures. What else? You had to state it up front. You had to state it up front. Because there is a branch of statistics or a method called internal pilots, where you actually start the trial and you are collecting the information with the ability to include those individuals in your final sample size as long as you don't. And what you're allowed to do is at the midway point after you've got your pilot, that's when you look at your variance and that's where you declare your final sample size. But you have to be able to say, I'm not altering my outcomes, I'm not altering my population, I'm not altering any way that I measured my outcomes. So it's a very restricted opportunity.
Is that what you do with that testing for the
Hmm? Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm trying. But I've only had 18 hours to think about it, so it's due in about 3 weeks. So, but I've thought about that, yeah.
Can you look at the outcomes though? Because it seems like this would be really easy to play. Like if the outcomes are unfavorable, to say, well, I'm going to tweak the protocol, but I don't have to count these.
Oh, it's easy to game the system. I probably shouldn't have made that smart aleck comment. At the end of the day, let me put it this way: if you've changed your protocol and refined, because part of the process is as you change the protocol and work out these things, the hope at the end of the pilot study is you have identified exactly what you're going to use and why. Again, I go back to where I started. At the end of the pilot study, you're really not looking for treatment effects. It's too early to make that judgment. You really haven't gathered enough information. All you're doing here is to demonstrate. I know after I finish this one up in preventive medicine, they're going to be all over these treatment differences, and I'm going to be the guy saying, no, 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 no. We weren't doing this to try to estimate treatment differences. I told you on day one, all I want out of this is the variance and the graph. So be very careful with that. The point is not to get caught up in, don't worry about p-values, don't worry about power, worry about what you need to measure, to demonstrate that you can measure it, that you can get it, okay? And that you can get to the population. That's what this goal is. Take the essential pieces to inform. If there is the opportunity to look at a treatment difference, look at it. Don't let it wag. Don't let the tail wag the dog. That was not the primary purpose of this.
But if you ballpark your sort of final sample size, and let's say the study's going to be 1,000 people and the pilot's 20, it seems like it would be much safer just to say I'm not going to those 20.
That's fine. I would agree with that. I would be fine with that.
So can I give you an example and you can tell me?
Sure.
So I wanted to use, it was an add-on to a bigger study. So people who ran the bigger study didn't want me to just sort of like go out there to start with. So I did a pilot like at UAB, and had nurses just hand the survey and just looked at it to see, and had a couple extra questions saying, is anything about this hard to answer or hard to understand? So I changed a couple of things, and then went to the people. Those people were testing.
I just liked them. Okay, good.
And so so then I sent it out to those people. So now through the mail, and it's the population I'm interested in. Everything looked okay. We got about the response rate we were expecting. So then we just sent everybody and started putting.
So you took the first random sample and kept them, and then you rolled them in.
Yeah.
Did you change anything with regard? I'm perfectly fine with that. Let me tell you a story. Remember the ERA funding? Do you know what I mean by ERA funding? We had designed a very large multi-site clinical trial. And we had just, missed it by that much. But here drops all the ERA funding. We wanted 5 years. We get a call from a project officer on a Friday afternoon saying that if we could have a letter of how we would revise the study, that they had enough money to fund us for the first 2 years. And we had until Monday at 5 o'clock to get the letter in. Thanks for the weekend. So what did I do? I'm technically having a 2-phase study here, almost like pilot and then the real. So we launched it all, and this is getting back to the effect size thing, okay? This gets getting back to the effect size thing. We ran it all for 2 years. We were, of course, nowhere near the sample size I had said we needed for the clinical trial. Got to that point, took the data, I took the variance estimates out and said, look, study section, my swag or my guesstimate of what the variance would be is almost identical to what was in the original power calculation. We need X number to finish the trial, but I did not reveal where our current treatment effect was to say that assuming this difference exists, then I need 300 more to get there. And I demonstrated that that was a reasonable belief based upon what we've seen so far. They funded the rest of 3 years, no problem. Finished it up. So, but the catch there is, if I had at that point, at that midpoint, said I'm changing the forms, or if I'm changing the outcome, or if I'm changing anything, then pretty much I've wiped out the first 2 years. You've got to think about that. So I like the way you were saying, if the definitive trial, if you're talking about 1 or 2% of your definitive trial, just let it go. But if it's a reasonable chunk, it may be worthwhile, if it is still the same, to meet with a methodologist and say, or even when you're designing the pilot study, is it worth to discuss what's called an internal pilot design to be able to utilize some of these individuals in the definitive trial. All right, I took that slide out, sorry about that, and I give you all of 9 minutes back. Okay? Should have done that. Just thump it. Did you have headphones on? Darn it, I should have thumped it.